So I would argue that if there's one team in the entire NBA that every other fan base is just kind of over, it's the Utah Jazz. Sorry, Jazz fans, I'm sure plenty of you clicked on this video, and it's not all gonna be negative, but for whatever reason, when the Donovan Mitchell to the Knicks rumors came out and Rudy Gobert struggles to defend in the playoffs and the Jazz as a team struggle in the postseason, it really brings the NBA community together. And now we go into an offseason where we could be looking at some big changes for this roster. They have won at least 44 games in every season since Donovan Mitchell was drafted. They've won 50 games 3 different times in that span, including earning the 1 seed last year, yet have won just 1 playoff series in the past 4 seasons. And if there's one thing in the NBA that really instigates and initiates big time roster movement, it is a team that makes the playoffs but does not perform when they get there. Essentially, being mediocre cultivates change, and that is exactly where the Utah Jazz find themselves this offseason. So now we have to figure out what has happened to this team, why they're not having success, what could happen to them this offseason in terms of trades and free agency, and then what actually makes sense for them to do. I'm not going to waste any time. I feel like we should go ahead and talk about the big thing first, and it's Donovan Mitchell. This is just the way that things work now in the NBA. If you are an all-star caliber player and you're not having postseason success, the assumption is that you're going to be wanting to look for a different team to play for. Publicly, Donovan Mitchell has not said anything otherwise. He has not said that he would like to leave Utah. He has not said that he wants to go elsewhere. He has not said that he is unhappy. However, this is just the way things work. I think it is a realistic assumption to think that he might be starting to think about a different team to play for. And this is the focal point. It's the turning point of the entire roster. Nothing else on this roster matters if Donovan Mitchell decides he does not want to be in Utah anymore and he requests a trade publicly or privately. That is the first domino to this entire situation. And quite frankly, it's pretty easy to make an argument that even with Donovan Mitchell there, they're not really going anywhere anyway, so maybe it's actually beneficial for him to force his way out. But we'll talk about the roster as a whole later. Let's really delve into the Donovan Mitchell situation. First and foremost, he's under contract until at least 2024, and he's 25 years old. He's clearly a building block for this franchise, and since the moment that he got there, he's really been empowered to be this high volume scorer and shooter, a guy that runs a lot of pick and rolls, a guy that takes a lot of shots. However, with this version of the Jazz, a lot of his flaws as a player and as a prospect are really being exposed. And it's on both sides of things, because when he came into the league, the expectation was that he was going to be a pretty good defender because of how good of an athlete he was. And then people also questioned his overall offensive game, but more specifically his passing vision. And defensively, he hasn't reached that ceiling. And passing wise, those concerns still exist. And it's just really weird the way that his career has gone, because I really feel like on the surface, he should be a good defender. He shouldn't be someone that should be getting absolutely cooked by Jalen Brunson in the postseason. And athletically and physically, he has all the tools to be a good defender, but he has not shown that whatsoever. Granted, he does have a large offensive responsibility, and typically that means you're not going to be very good defensively from an effort standpoint, but it still certainly can be better. And at this point, even though obviously he is just 25 years old, he's still got some room to grow. If he's not shooting the ball well, if he's not scoring well, he doesn't really provide a ton of other value to the team given his limitations defensively and as a playmaker. And at the end of the day, when you're a Utah team that relies on Donovan Mitchell as much as they do, that's obviously a huge problem. We can talk about the issues with Rudy Gobert defensively in the postseason. We're going to talk about that. We can talk about this roster as a whole in terms of their inability to get guys on the floor that can guard. We're going to talk about that as well. But I do think that we need to start looking at Donovan Mitchell as someone that should be taking at least some amount of the responsibility for the fact that Utah not only can't perform in the postseason, but really feels like a stagnant team. Like I said, he can still get better, but if you're looking at him as someone that could possibly be like the number 1 guy on a championship team, that feels very unlikely to me at this point in his career. Now, having said that, if he wants to leave, if he asks out, someone's going to trade for him. There's going to be significant interest in him. There's going to be a ton of teams that are going to be willing to give up a lot in order to get Donovan Mitchell. But I don't want to just continue this video making everybody think that he's blameless in what's happening in Utah. Having said that, we do have to talk about the guy that everybody always seems to pile on when it comes to negative stuff happening with the Jazz, and it's Rudy Gobert. We'll go ahead and start with the negative stuff because I think that's what everybody wants to hear, right? He's almost 30 years old. He's got one of the biggest contracts in the entire league over the next couple of seasons, certainly in terms of players at the 5 spot. And as good as he is defensively, specifically in the regular season, he's probably the best rim protector in the entire league. This is multiple postseasons in a row now where when they get into a matchup against a team like the Clippers or a team like the Mavs, if they space him out and take him away from the rim and they hit corner threes, he is completely unable to punish the team on the other end of the floor floor for playing smaller players. That, I feel like, is the differentiator between understanding the real issue with Rudy Gobert and not. A lot of people like to talk about, oh, well, he gets played off the floor because he can't guard. It's actually not as big of a deal as we make it seem like. The problem is he can't score. He's not a good enough offensive player to punish teams for playing small. If he was a good enough offensive player to punish other teams for putting small players on the floor, the defensive stuff would not be nearly as much of an issue. And so for a lot of people, the very obvious answer to the question of what the Jazz should do this offseason is finding a trade partner for Rudy Gobert. The Donovan Mitchell Gobert thing has been tenuous for at least the last season and a half to 2 seasons. It feels like a move that not only could relieve some of the pressure on Mitchell to potentially want to ask out, maybe that'll improve kind of just his situation with the team, but from a roster perspective as well, it might be time to change some things up. Here's the problem with that. Rudy Gobert is the only reason the Jazz are not one of the 5 worst defensive teams in the entire league. If you take him out and you put a league average rim protector on this team, for example, let's just say that he goes to Atlanta, you get Clint Capella and some stuff back. If you don't improve your wing defenders and Donovan Mitchell does not become a better defender and Mike Conley continues to be a bad defender, if all those things are still the case and you just swap out Rudy Gobert with someone else just for the vibes, you're going to be one of the worst defensive teams in the league. Their ability to be a top 10 defensive team in the league relies entirely in the regular season on Rudy Gobert's ability to make up for everybody else's mistakes better than any other 5-man in the entire league. And if you take that away, you are going to crater completely on the defensive end of the floor. Now, I do think there are some options out there that could be intriguing that would allow Utah to turn Gobert into a different, cheaper 5 and potentially get some wings back that can either score a little bit better and relieve some of that pressure off of Donovan Mitchell as the main offensive guy, and or be a pretty good wing defender as well and shore up some of those issues so it's not just funnel everything to the rim and let Rudy clean up all the mistakes. The problem is, if you're looking at teams like Atlanta, teams like Charlotte, those trades make way more sense for those 2 teams than it does for Utah, assuming Mitchell still wants to be there. Like, if you're the Hawks or you're the Hornets and you trade for Rudy Gobert, pretty much independent of anybody else you put on the floor, those teams can become top half of the league defensive teams just because they're going to have Rudy Gobert on their team. Atlanta, Charlotte, those are 2 teams that really need an upgrade to the 5. They've got a couple of different wings they can trade to Utah, and it's very clear that would help them a ton. The reason it's clear is because it's what's been happening with the Jazz for the last couple of seasons. Bad wing defenders plus Rudy Gobert means top half of the league defensive team, and that's kind of what Charlotte and Atlanta need. But for Utah, unless Mitchell wants to leave and you suddenly become the post-Russ Paul George Oklahoma City Thunder, where you trade 2 stars overnight and all of a sudden the entire trajectory of your team changes. Unless that happens, there isn't really a Gobert trade out there that makes complete and total sense for Utah, at least not enough sense to actually make the move. It might be a lateral move, but it's not going to make them any more of a contender than they are right now, which is the fact that they aren't one. And so I mention all this to say that I think a lot of the narrative around this team this offseason is going to be either Mitchell might want out, which I think is realistic, or trade Gobert no matter what. Just make a move to make a move. And I understand that sentiment. I get it. They're very stuck. In large part, unless Mitchell wants out, they're kind of out of options. But to say that if you just trade Rudy Gobert, that fixes this team and everything's great and they're going to suddenly become a really good playoff team, I don't think that's even close to accurate. And I'm sure at this point of the video, a lot of you are wondering, okay, well, if Mitchell doesn't ask out, you're saying don't trade him, correct? If you're saying that trading Gobert doesn't actually help them, correct? What do? Well, that's kind of the point of the video. They're kind of screwed. If they're almost in a point where it makes more sense to completely reset the roster than it does to retool it. But I think ultimately that's what they're going to attempt to do. They're going to try and find some guys that they can trade for with some of these bigger contracts on their roster to get a couple of 2-way players, a couple of wings that can actually guard and can score. And maybe that can shore up some of their defensive issues. They still would have Gobert there. Maybe they can be a top 5 team defensively next year and be a little bit more prepared for the postseason. You're thinking about guys like Jeremy Grant, who I'm probably going to mention in like every single offseason video, is a guy that could potentially really help Utah. The problem is they've got those bigger contracts that are going to be difficult to move. A lot of those guys are aging, Bogdanovich, Conley, and they owe future picks. They owe a pick in 2022 to Memphis. They owe a pick in 2024 as well. And that's obviously going to be prohibitive to them being able to bring someone in, because then you're looking at trades in 2026 and 2028 first round picks. And that's a very, very dangerous game to play as a smaller market team that could lose their star at literally any moment. Now, I mentioned in the beginning that the entire video is not going to be negative if you're a Jazz fan. This is where that comes into play. There's nothing wrong with what the Jazz have done over the last couple of seasons. They went from a situation where Gordon Hayward leaves and no team ever recovers well from a player like that leaving when they don't have a ton of other pieces. Utah still managed to put together a group that, as I said, was the 1 seed last year, came very close to making the conference finals, and have been playoff contenders. They've won 50-plus games multiple times over the last couple of seasons, and there are 10 to 12 franchises in this league that would have loved to have the amount of success that Utah has had the last couple of seasons, even without the postseason success. So it's not like they've done anything wrong. They've actually done a fantastic job, potentially too good of a job, of putting together a group that is very, very good. The problem is there's not really a path to them becoming great. Unless Donovan Mitchell becomes a lockdown defender tomorrow and they're able to add Jeremy Grant and another wing and keep their offensive versatility as well as be a little bit better defensively on the wings. Unless all of those things happen, there's zero path to contention. Now, that doesn't mean they can't just continue to run it back and continue to be a decent team. That's not a bad option, and it's something that, again, a lot of other franchises would really like to have had over the last couple of seasons. It's just, if you're a Jazz fan, you're probably looking at this and wondering, okay, well, we're just signing up for losing in the first or the second round for the entirety of the rest of the time that this group is together. And that's not as bad as, for example, being a Kings fan, a team that never really seems to have any real hope, never makes the postseason, but it's also not as good as the hope of potentially having a championship team. And I think Utah has to decide either they're going to completely tear down this roster and or Mitchell is going to ask out, or be okay with winning 47 games and winning maybe one playoff series for the entirety of the time this group is still together.